I'll say a little bit about the speaker in a second. I want to begin by just talking about how this has come about very briefly. And that was a year ago, a group of staff from 3 of Glasgow's different colleges got together with very broadly based global security interests to see if there were areas that we could cooperate and move on. And from that one meeting, really a year ago, we've now progressed to the point where we have a number of exciting programs on offer. There's a new degree, a master's in global security. There's regular staff seminars, and we hope a regular series of major lectures on global security issues. Now, we're very lucky to start this series of major lectures with Professor Hew Strachan. And right away, with just seeing the number of people in this room, we know we made the right choice. Professor Strachan is now the Chichele Professor of the History of War at Oxford University. Before that, however, he had the much more senior position of Professor of Modern History at Glasgow University. And he's one of the reasons that we are here today. Under Hew's professorship, the Scottish Centre for War Studies was founded, which has provided one of the different elements which is fed into the growth of global security at Glasgow. Now, introducing Hew is actually a rather difficult task. I went on the website at Oxford, and there were 25 major publications, and I will not read them all out to you. I will mention 1 or 2 of them to give you a flavor of his work, but really there's a vast corpus of Strachan on the market. His most famous book is The History of the First World War, Volume 1, in 1,200 pages, which is an astonishing achievement in scholarship, bringing together sources in English, German, French, Russian, a really remarkable historical work on the First World War, and we're waiting for the second volume. But he's published widely since that, a lot on the British Army. He published the most important volume, new translation of Clausewitz, a few years ago, which I think has helped change our vision of what Clausewitz said and did. Hew has also advised the government. You're more likely to get emails from him coming from Whitehall than you are at Oxford. He travels widely, he publishes widely. Tonight, he is speaking on the changing character of war. Thank you, Phil.
Number of challenges. Number 1, sound, working. Number 2, gravity. Get rid of that. And number 3, I have to say, not a challenge, delight to be back in Glasgow. Phil's quite right. It's been downhill ever since I left here. And it's really great also to see some well-kent faces. The title, The Changing Character of War, is a title which I chose because we've been running a program with that name for the last 7 years at Oxford. And there comes a point when you've had money from other institutions for 7 years and you've been thinking about a topic for 7 years when you have to start defining what you mean. This is the moment, if you like, where the rubber hits the road. And I always begin a statement about what we're doing by a distinction drawn from Clausewitz, which is the importance of drawing a distinction between the nature of war and the character of war. You may think this is a matter of semantics, and I'm afraid there will be quite a lot of semantics on what I want to say. But what Clausewitz meant by that was that the nature of war has a certain constancy, a continuity. That there is something fundamental about war which distinguishes it from other activities, and it is characterized by things like the element of chance, confusion, the chaos of war. It's also characterized by the courage required of those who serve in wartime, take part in war, and above all, it's characterized by the opening line of On War, which is that war is a clash of wills, that it's an act of reciprocity that it involves two sides having a go at each other, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. What he means by the character of war is something that is much more changeable. At the end of On War, in Book 8, Chapter 6, there is a description of the history of war, which focuses on the big three in his eyes, Alexander the Great, Gustavus Adolphus, and Napoleon. And what he describes in that is not constancy, not continuity, but how war has changed over history. And it is that aspect, what has changed and what hasn't changed, that seems to me a particular responsibility for those of us who are historians when we're trying to think what it is about war that is different, distinctive, and what distinguishes war today from war yesterday, and what might distinguish war in the future from war as we currently know it. During the 20th century, we got used to the notion that the key determinant in the changing character of war was technology. It was very easy if you served in the First World War, and indeed it was entirely logical if you served in the First World War, to conclude that the war was shaped by tactics, by the conditions of war on the Western Front, and to conclude too that those tactics were the product, above all, of what had happened to artillery and the way in which the artillery battle was engaged in. That technology was the determinant, not least also because of the advent of air power, that no longer could you necessarily take cover behind a hill and be unobserved, because of course there might be that eye in the sky which would spot where you were. And the consequence, of course, of that was so much more had to be done at night rather than during the day in order to avoid aerial observation. If you'd had the good luck to serve in Glasgow, of course, that wouldn't have been a problem, because there never would have been enough clarity in the air for you to be able to see what was going on the ground. And of course, that was also true for a lot of the Western Front for much of the time. But the point still remains that air power changed things almost as much as artillery did. In the Second World War, the same argument could be sustained. Obviously, by then, the aircraft was a mature weapons system, capable of at least claiming to be able to conduct an independent air campaign. Whether, of course, it did so successfully is a matter still for debate. And then, above all, of course, the advent of the tank as a mature weapon system also, and that combination of tanks and aircraft became the weapons which shaped our understanding of so much of what that war was about. And then the Cold War, with the dropping of the atomic bomb, or bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, a vision of a war, thankfully a war which never took place, which was above all determined on a weapons capability, was above all the product of technology and of what physicists had enabled weapon systems to become. And even with the end of the Cold War, that presumption that technology was the most important driver in understanding the changing character of war persisted. And it persisted particularly for the powers of NATO. Because as they lacked a clear and coherent enemy, the existential angst, I have to say, in the British Armed Forces in 1991, when there was no longer a Cold War and no longer a scenario, say, what the hell are we doing and against whom are we preparing to fight? That moment, when there was no enemy, then the logical thing, of course, was to match yourself against your ally. Instead of worrying about the Soviet Union, the great cry in the 1990s in MOD is, are we up to the United States? Are we capable of fighting alongside the United States? Are we a viable ally? And that meant, of course, have we got the same technology, or have we got technologies that are compatible and operable alongside our allies? And all those buzz phrases, now so often discredited, and probably rightly so, from the 1990s, the revolution in military affairs, the network-centric capabilities, all those things came out of that presumption that technology had actually transformed the character of war. Transformation itself, of course, became an important word. And that those things, to such an extent that they affected, that they might even have changed the nature of war itself. That so precise was the business of targeting, so precise even was the business of target acquisition, that you could actually get over even the Glasgow weather and as a consequence be able to direct a weapon with accuracy and certainty onto your target, and had therefore removed the chaos, friction, fog and confusion from war. Now, I stress all that in order to make a point, because since the beginning of the 21st century, our understanding of the changing character of war has been much less driven by technology than was the case during the course of the 20th century. When Clausewitz wrote on war, and one of the reasons I think we continue to read him, technology wasn't actually the big driver explaining the changing character of war. The wars in which he fought, the Napoleonic Wars, would have been familiar to the Duke of Marlborough if he'd suddenly found himself magically propelled into the early 19th century. He would have been able, I suspect, to control the battlefield of Waterloo as well as he controlled the battlefield at Blenheim. And he could have done that because, broadly speaking, musketry was unchanged, artillery was a bit improved, but that was really about it. The big change that had occurred was not a technological change, but a change that was determined socially and politically, that was to be understood in other terms, and was above all, of course, the product, as we would like to see it, admittedly in perhaps a simplistic shorthand sense, was the product of the French Revolution. What had happened was the transformation in the power of the state. The state was now able to mobilize armies that were massive compared with their 18th century predecessors. Most of the battles in which the French revolutionary armies had fought in the early 1790s involved forces of about 50,000, max 70,000 at any one time. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, you're seeing field armies of 300,000, 350,000 at battles like Leipzig. Much more importantly, in those battles, if you suffered great losses, you had the capacity to replace the men that you lost. So it was not just that you could fight bigger battles, but you could fight them more often. Armies could be regenerated thanks to conscription, thanks to the power to enlist men compulsorily, and to say that you were doing so, not in the name of some tyrant, some absolute monarch, but in the name of the state of which at least ostensibly you were a citizen. Now, I realize all that notion of democratization is more rhetoric than substance, but the point remains that the rhetoric legitimized the nation in arms. And interestingly, that business of popular mobilization became fundamentally important to Clausewitz, because in 1812, beginning of February 1812, when the King of Prussia, Friedrich Wilhelm, agreed to supply a contingent of Prussian troops to serve in the French army as Napoleon was about to invade Russia. When that happened, a number of Prussian officers, including Clausewitz, were absolutely outraged by this, and Clausewitz himself decided to resign from the Prussian army and join the Russian army. A good example of how the subordination of the military to political control did not apply in his case. And what he then did, what he was then calling for, was the notion of a true nation in arms. That not just the Prussian people, but the German people, he wrote a manifesto addressed to Germans, not just to Prussians, should mobilize, self-mobilize, we might say today, in order to wage an insurgent campaign using terror against French rule. And that, when he came to write on war, and when he tried to imagine the future, which he does only very fleetingly in On War, when he tried to imagine the future, he said, what will the future of war be like? Well, we can't be absolutely sure. We may go back to more limited wars as we had in the 18th century, or we may have wars of a scale which we experienced in the Napoleonic Wars. But, he said, one real possibility is that we have a true nation in arms, that we have a population that is ready to fight and fight for its rights and its freedoms, and that will be more terrifying than anything we have seen hitherto. So the point I'm making out of Clausewitz, and the point I want to make about, in part about his relevance today, but also about how we see war today, is that that notion of social and political change as being a key driver and possibly the key driver in how we understand the character of war seems to me immensely important. Just think about the application of armed force by the United States since 9/11. The United States remains the preeminent military power in the world in terms of its capabilities. It uses a fraction of those capabilities in Afghanistan. It used a fraction of those capabilities in Iraq. It doesn't mean that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan haven't put an enormous strain on the United States Army and United States Marine Corps in particular, but what it does mean is that there are a large number of other assets, particularly those of sea power, and also, of course, its nuclear capabilities, which have been totally redundant in this war, because in the end, those have not been deemed appropriate, and this is another point that I'll come back to that. Moreover, the wars in which they have been engaged have not been shaped preeminently by the technological capabilities of their opponents. That is not to say that there isn't an enormously important application of high-end technology in Afghanistan. Clearly there is, particularly in terms of target acquisition. But what it does mean is that those technologies that really drive the newspapers and drive the reporting, and actually drive much of the casualties and the deaths that are incurred in the war in Afghanistan, are low-level technologies. Above all, of course, IEDs, but also things like RPGs, AK-47 rifles, and so on and so forth. And what we focus on when we think about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are, to reiterate a point, social, cultural, and political structures rather more than the technological capabilities which those who are engaged in the war or wars have available to them. Tribal loyalties, to put it more fairly crudely, are more important than air power in terms of explaining why this war has gone on. If it was simply a matter of air power, the war would be over because there is no serious air threat in Afghanistan. So the issue here is, how do we now reconstruct war if that is a viable presumption? If we are looking at that, at war in the light of social and political change being its key factor. Because the other aspect that we have to confront is where we stand in relation to the state, if the state is, or still has a claim to be, one of the principal users of military capability. Our vision of war, for all that we have experiences derived from the recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, or even from the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s, our vision of war and much of the vocabulary that those who are engaged in military studies and military history and strategic studies use is a vocabulary derived from the experience of the Second World War. It starts with a phrase I particularly dislike in the NATO vocabulary, and you will find it all through British military service as well, the phrase, the spectrum of conflict. And the spectrum of conflict has peace at one end, with the presumption that somehow peace is an aspect of war. I hope it's the flip side of war rather than an aspect of war. And at the other side, general war, which means an all-out nuclear exchange. The sort of war games I remember doing in the Allenbrook Hall at Camberley in the 1980s, which always ended with a nuclear release at the point where the thing became interesting. That spectrum of conflict presumes that all-out nuclear exchange, that general war, is our yardstick. And it derives its weight, nuclear deterrence has derived its weight, not so much from the direct experience of the use of nuclear weapons, because fortunately our direct experience of those is extraordinarily limited, but from the experience of the Second World War. and particularly the years between 1941 and 1945, when, of course, the phrase total war referred not so much to the fact that you were using technologies of awesome destructiveness, which indeed you were, but because those wars required the political, just to repeat the point, political and social mobilization of the states concerned. When Goebbels gave his famous total war speech in the Sportspalast, what he was actually saying was to the German people in the German army is, you are running out of kit, you've got to start using something else. In other words, you've got to be mobilized or self-mobilized to fight this war. And Churchill, when he also used the phrase total war in his speeches during the Second World War, was also using it as a device for mobilization. The problem that we confront, and we have confronted since the end of the Cold War, is that we have carried that particular legacy with us. The presumption that real war is total war, that real war is general war, and that everything else is to be matched against it. To that extent, the Second World War, I do talk about the First World War far too often, so I get out of the habit. The Second World War has left a long theoretical legacy. It is still the war, no doubt, thanks to endless repeats of the World at War, that best encapsulates most people's understanding of what war is, even if it no longer best encapsulates the dominant experience of war in the world today. Now, that is not to say that the theoretical legacy which the Second World War has left, which total war has left, has not had a constructive role to play. It has, because during the Cold War, it provided the intellectual underpinnings of deterrence. Deterrence, as I already said, in its most general sense, rested on a memory of the destruction caused by the Second World War, kept alive that memory, and gave it a role in the management of international relations. Moreover, in its most general sense, deterrence, I would argue, still operates in the prevention of major war, although, particularly here in Britain, it is very striking in its absence from public discourse and public debate. One of the most striking things, if you move to read defense white papers, and one of the things I have to spend too much time doing these days is reading defense white papers and remaining sane at the same time. But if there is a good defense white paper to look at, or an interesting one certainly, it is the Australian one of 2009. What is interesting about the Australian defense white paper is that it actually gets away from platitudes and simply says, we're defending Australia, guys, that's what we're trying to do. It's quite easy, of course, when you have a contiguous landmass and your nearest military threat is New Zealand, and even that is 3 hours flight time across the Tasman. But nonetheless, if you are geographically favoured, as Australia does, at least provide some coherence in what you're doing in relation to defence. And what they say in the Australian Defence White Paper is therefore very national in its presumptions. But what is interesting is that at one point it does refer to the United States, and what it says about that relationship with the United States, this of course was published before Julia Gillard and Barack Obama had problems with each other's bottoms last week. What that says is that extended deterrence provided by the United States is one of the things that provides security for us in the Pacific. So in other words, a country which is actually profoundly non-nuclear in its approach recognizes the stabilizing quality that is provided by the United States' possession of nuclear weapons in the world today. And I stress that because if deterrence has a function in preventing war, then it may also help us explain the character of the wars which we are confronting today. The wars that actually occur contain, of course, within them elements of deterrence, intra-war deterrence, as it was known to all those RAND think tank people in the era of the Cold War. Because what the deterrence does within war is to limit it, to shape it. Don't you imagine that if NATO lacked air supremacy, that the Taliban wouldn't fight in a different way? Would they not, for example, be much freer to concentrate and mass forces if they didn't confront the possibility of a rapid airstrike if an airstrike is called in? In other words, the war can be shaped by the possession of a capability which actually deters the enemy from doing something. But what is also, I think, striking about the function of deterrence is that the most obvious point to make about our attitudes to war in 2011 is that although our vocabulary and understanding of war may be shaped by the legacy of the Second World War, what we also presume, particularly we here in Europe, what we also presume is that there is no immediate threat of major war. We live, in our own eyes, in an extraordinarily secure world. So we both hype the threat and realize a reality which is rather less than the threat. And I think that is one of the reasons why we have become very confused about what the character of today's war is, or we have become confused at least since the end of the Cold War, and even more probably since 9/11. Our reason for that is in part a complacency about the state and the relationship between the state and the war, and war. Because we have no serious expectation of major interstate war, we also see the possibility that the state would use war in the pursuit of political objectives as incoherent, unlikely, and probably even folly. There is a paradox, really, that in Europe, Clausewitz is seen as bunkum. It's a paradox, of course, because Clausewitz, as a Prussian, is probably most unwelcome in Germany of all states in Europe, because the notion that war might be the continuation of policy by other means makes less sense in Germany today, in German politics today, that is, than it makes sense in the politics of almost any other country. And of all European countries where it makes most sense, the answer is probably here in the United Kingdom and possibly to a lesser extent to France. But we assume, all of us Europeans, and I don't just mean Germans, but I mean Brits as well, all of us assume that war does not have utility. Not least because for Europeans, and particularly for mainland Europeans, the Second World War essentially meant the destruction of Europe. So war cannot be the continuation of policy, but actually a failure of policy. That war represents a fundamental break, a fundamental change, rather than a continuity in that sense. But if we conclude from that, that therefore war, that regular interstate war does not occur, then we're going around with our eyes shut. There is a presumption that major interstate war has been in decline since 1945. Well, to some extent, that is true. Since 1945, it is striking that interstate wars have happened less frequently than they did before 1945, and I would argue that the United Nations, that much abused organization, should get a great deal of credit for that. Broadly speaking, it did pick up where the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 had failed, and it did make it inherently difficult for a state to go to war, even a sovereign state, unless it had a clear legitimating cause in the shape of self-defense. What we have become used to is the notion that the prevalent form of war in the world since 1945 has been that of civil war. But in fact, what has happened since really the late 1990s is that civil war, too, has been in decline. The argument would be that as the European powers withdrew from their empires in the 1950s and 1960s, so the states that achieved independence after their withdrawal engaged in civil war as a process of defining what those states were, or what those states are. But as that process of definition became more secure, more complete, so the states themselves acquired a solidity, which did not then produce civil war. So the incidence of civil war, for all the impression given by the press, the incidence of civil war is declining. And this is the one overhead I should have had, but as I never have overheads, I never remember to bring one. If you actually look at the incidence of war in the world since 1945, what you will therefore see is indeed a graph that does that for civil war. Not quite as dramatic, but it's going like that. But what you will then also notice, bumping along the bottom at a very consistent rate, is interstate war. Not that it hasn't changed dramatically since 1945, it has, but since then, with the exception of 1990 to 1992, we've had interstate wars pretty frequently and at roughly the same rate. And it's worth just remembering how much Britain itself has contributed to that rate. Fighting Argentina in 1982, which of course for me is just the other day, for most of you is light years ago. Iraq in 1990-91, sure, as part of an alliance, but still an interstate war. Serbia in 1999, and Iraq again in 2003, and most recently, of course, even this year, Libya in 2011. It is in that respect quite surprising that when Britain produced its first national security strategy in March 2008, the opening presumption of that was that interstate war was the least likely of all the threats facing the United Kingdom. Didn't actually bear much relationship to the evidence. What has happened in the latest version, in the 2010 National Security Strategy, was that interstate war would, if it occurred, because the National Security Strategy of last year has a risk register, just like the University of Glasgow has a risk register, I assume it does anyway, what it does with that risk register is say that interstate war will be a high-impact event, but one of low probability. This, of course, is before the war with Libya in 2011. What it really means to say, and what, of course, the 2008 National Security Strategy really meant to say, is not that interstate war is a low probability, but major interstate war is a low probability. The absence of major war does not mean the absence of interstate war. States still use war to pursue policy goals. I already said the United Kingdom does, but so does Russia, so does Israel, so does the United States, most evidently. The state, moreover, is still the biggest player in the business of war. It is worth stressing that point, partly because during the 1990s, a literature was produced, beginning with Martin van Creveld in his book on future war, published in 1991. Bad timing that. Not a bad book, but shouldn't have published it just as the first Iraq war was underway, if you want to say that interstate war has gone off the agenda. And then, completing the process, Mary Cowlell's book, New and Old Wars, Old and New Wars, I can never get the right order of the title, published in 1999. Both of those books effectively saying that non-state actors will be the dominant players in future war, and Mary Cowlell particularly stressing that states wouldn't go to war, the people who would go to war would be warlords. Warlords will go to war because actually they need war in order to be warlords. And once you've gone to war, you go on fighting because that's how you run your crime activities, your prostitution rackets, your drug cartels. War is a way of keeping you in power. You have no interest, therefore, in seeking peace. Now, I'm not saying there aren't lots of non-state actors and lots of warlords going around the world today, and some of them, of course, are evident, very much so indeed, in Afghanistan. But what I think is striking about that perception in the 1990s is if you look at the wars that have occurred over the last decade, is how many of the attributes of the state are still present in helping us to understand those wars. Even if you look at the non-state actors, what drives warlordism? Well, of course it can be criminal activity, but also very often it is the issue of tribal loyalty, it is the issue of ethnic identity, and very often is the aspiration to statehood entertained by those very tribes and ethnic groups. And when we counter them, what vocabulary do we use to explain what we're doing? We talk about failed states. rogue states. And the implication is we want a state that hasn't failed, or a state that is not rogue, and then the world will be a better place. In other words, we're endorsing the state system, not undermining it. The main objects, at least in many of the NATO rationalizations, for the forces in Afghanistan, of the war in Afghanistan, are the good governance of Afghanistan, the better governance of Afghanistan. The NATO plan for the withdrawal from Afghanistan would make perfectly good sense if there weren't one particular catch in the whole problem, which is a viable government for Afghanistan. If there were a viable government for Afghanistan, the plan would be wonderful. And the challenge, therefore, is indeed a governmental state one. Moreover, if you read any account of emerging security challenges in today's world, if you read, for example, the sorts of things that were instantly available on the Pentagon website before 9/11, and are still available, for example, if you read the Strategic Trends document, which is produced by the Defence Concepts and Doctrine Centre in the British Ministry of Defence, if you read those documents and look out as to how they are imagining the future, what they all pivot on is the presumption that the state will still be central to war. They confirm the centrality of the state. Let me explain what I mean. Because that's not what they seem to be focusing on in the first instance. What they seem to be focusing on when they look 20, 30, 40 years out, Strategic Trends looks 40 years out, is they're focusing on the challenges of things like climate change. They see the issue of climate change as likely to have destabilizing consequences in the world. They focus on issues of human security, of health, of the possibility of a flu epidemic, of massive urbanization, of the consequences of people living in slums with inadequate food, inadequate water supply, inadequate rubbish collection, health problems, and so on and so forth. All these issues they focus on. But then, what happens? How will those developments, assuming we don't manage to control them, direct them, and produce a better world over the next 30 to 40 years, how will those actually cause war? What is the link between these trends and the presumption that these are a security threat in the shape of war rather than a threat to the security of individual human beings? And my answer to that question is that actually the pressures will be felt by states, and they will be felt on the frontiers of states. If there is going to be dispute over the ownership of water, it'll be jolly good news for Scotland, won't it? If there is going to be a dispute over the ownership of water, then that will be something determined, fresh water as opposed to salt water, by state frontiers. The control of the Nile's waters, for example, is something currently regulated by agreements between the states that border or that draw water and irrigation from the River Nile. It's a state matter. If there is going to be a dispute over migration flows, what should happen to refugees going from Libya into Europe or from the Balkans into Europe in the 1990s? That is a state matter. If the Arctic melts, if it is melting, if the rate of melt increases, what is going to happen? The answer is states are already staking their claims to the formations under the ice, to the possibility of resources, and are talking about the militarization of the Arctic. What will follow if the Arctic turns into ocean is conflict at sea, it would seem. Now, I hope that all these human security dilemmas will actually be resolved short of war and without their militarization, that they will not convert into national security issues. But the point is that if they do, then what is likely to follow is interstate war. But here's the good news, that it seems to me interstate war which is likely to be limited, at least in a geographical sense. And that has the potential to produce a greater symmetry between the way states are actually using war today and the vocabulary that they use to justify and explain war. The wars which are being waged today are limited in comparison with the First and the Second World Wars. But the vocabulary that we use to describe them, and I don't just mean that conceptual vocabulary of total war and of the spectrum of conflict, the vocabulary that we use to describe them is not limited. The most obvious example was the decision of President Bush to dub what the United States did after 9/11 as the global war on terror. Nothing limited about that. The decision to succeed the idea of the global war on terror with the long war, which continues to have resonance in the Pentagon, and I have to say continues to have resonance in the Ministry of Defense, seems to me also a way of conflating your problems, of aggregating your problems, of making them bigger rather than more manageable. And one of the reasons for doing that, for using these big phrases, is the objects for which wars are being fought are presented as ideological, open-ended, and absolute. We're engaged in wars for democracy, for freedom, for religious belief. And even when, as President Obama did when he entered office, you ramp down the rhetoric, you actually find it pretty hard to convert a big war into a small war again. Once you've done it, he's trying to do it, it's proving very difficult to make that war more manageable. Partly because structurally the United States as a state now has agencies which reflect the big war assumption, including, of course, the whole paraphernalia associated with homeland security. But also, if you have declared a global war on terror, it's pretty hard to undeclare it while you've still got the enemy in play. So the paradox of having wars with big objectives, at least in declaratory terms, but only being ready to use limited means and limited levels of mobilization to fight them, puts you in a pretty confused place. It particularly puts us domestically in a pretty confused place, because we have statesmen who tell us these wars are necessary, and we have publics who believe they're totally unnecessary. You have publics walking along University Avenue right now who certainly do not think themselves at war, despite the fact we are a state at war in the sense that our armed forces are in some pretty dangerous places. And the open-endedness of those objectives means that we employ a rhetoric which actually very often discredits a readiness to appease, to use a word that is loaded from the 1930s, and to use a word Tony Blair regularly applied when he talked about relations with Saddam Hussein before the invasion of Iraq, or which, of course, uses the threat, and as Evan Maudsley, of course, is thinking about 1941, the threat of Pearl Harbor and the danger of that in American mentality, which, of course, 9/11 played to so effectively. The upshot of all that is that we engage in wars with seemingly big objectives, but without the resolution, mobilization, or resources to fight them. Now, what do we do about that? Information operations, stratcoms, strategic communications, or as I would prefer to call it, propaganda, and I don't mean that in any sense pejoratively, because states in war use propaganda and use it for perfectly reasonable motivations. It is an instrument of war. Information operations tend to focus in their effect on the enemy, arguing, of course, that everything you do on the ground, particularly if you are fighting, in Rupert Smith's overquoted phrase, war amongst the people, particularly if you're fighting a war among the people, information operations need to focus on the effect of what you are doing militarily on the opinion of those among whom you are fighting. But what we fail to recognize, of course, is that those operations also have an effect on the relationship between governments, their armed forces, and the people those governments and armed forces are serving. And that therefore, not only are you communicating when you're fighting in Afghanistan, to take the obvious case, or in Libya, to take an obvious case, but you're also communicating to the people within Britain, if you're on the British Armed Forces and you are the British government. And there is a change in that relationship, not just because of the mismatch in the vocabulary that is used, and here I am getting back to the subject of technology, but also, of course, because technology has changed the means of communication. Not, as my wife will quickly tell you, that I'm very good at using mobile telephones, but the mobile telephone is, above all, at that level, an agent of democratization, a means of rapid communication. A means where what happens in the news cycle is ahead of the ability of governments to respond to it effectively. That what happens here in terms of our reaction to events in Afghanistan or Iraq runs ahead of the ability of the Secretary of State for Defense necessarily to know what has happened. Classic illustration, which some of you may remember, when John Reed was Secretary of State for Defense, and there was a front page photograph of a guy, British soldier, bailing out of a tank with his uniform on fire, or his protective gear on fire. This was actually the culmination of a successful operation in order to rescue guys from the Iraqi police, but was presented by the newspapers at the time as evidence of failure and defeat in Iraq. There is a paradox in this, because how is it that we, fighting wars in the name of democracy, are actually frightened of instruments which democratize communications, which give people more power, which, of course, in the context of Burma or China, we see as agents of change for the good? And how are we in a position where we feel we can no longer control the narrative in the way in which Alistair Campbell would claim that he controlled the narrative during the Kosovo campaign? The challenge is, I think, partly that, in fact, the vocabulary that we are using is the problem rather than more than the technology. The government has tended to focus its concerns on the technology because it sees the technology as enabling change in other countries, in Libya as well as in China and Burma, but sees the impact of the technology at home as a consequence not of the technology working adversely, rather than recognizing that, of course, if they hype the threat from domestic terrorism, and if they explain that the war in Afghanistan is preempting that threat, and then the public doesn't believe it, then the fault is the public's, and the fault is the consequence of the media failing to get the message across adequately, rather than maybe the message is not being put, the sensible message is not being put over in the first place. What the public see, thanks to the change in communication, better watch the time, had I, Phil? How am I doing? 5 more minutes? What the public see is something rather different. Help for Heroes, not so much in Scotland, of course, but south of the border, a very successful charity in terms of mobilizing public appreciation of the armed forces. In terms of the link between government, armed forces, and the people, Help for Heroes has had a very powerful role in energizing the relationship between the people and the armed forces. But of course, the consequence of that is that Help for Heroes has portrayed members of the armed forces as victims rather than as victors. And the result of that is a tension between governments which see utility in war, even if they don't call it war, and their populations which regard war as lacking utility because what war does is kill British armed forces personnel and wound them even greater numbers. And the irony is that wars of humanitarian intervention, as the war in Libya was authorized by UN Security Council resolution, for all that UN Security Council resolution may in some eyes have been hijacked. Wars of humanitarian intervention should ease that tension because it should have the potential to divide liberal opposition to war between those who would oppose all war wherever it is and those who say, well, here is war fought for a legitimate purpose and a good cause. In the case of Afghanistan, such a war exposes a real challenge, it seems to me, which lies at the heart of where we're going with war, not least the heart of where I'm going to go with this lecture, given the fact I'm out of time. Let me just rephrase that a bit, because what I think let me carry on with that. What I was going to say is that the heart of the problem is this, that if you are looking at the war in Afghanistan in terms of our security, as opposed to a war of humanitarian intervention, a war to bring good governance to Afghanistan, a war to ensure that girls in Afghanistan can go to school, that there is a functioning democracy, and so on and so forth. If you see the war as a war of our security, then you see the war as a war of counterterrorism. This, of course, was the great debate between Vice President Joe Biden and particularly embodied on the other side by Generals David Petraeus and Stanley McChrystal, which is that that's not how you're seeing this war. You're seeing this war in terms of counterinsurgency, and the implication within counterinsurgency was not that just you're going to target terrorists and remove the direct security threat to the United States or to the United Kingdom or to other countries within Europe, but that also you are going further than that, because what you're trying to do is remove insurgency that is indigenous to Afghanistan, that presents no threat to us, and at the same time set out to create a functioning government in Afghanistan, not least because, of course, that should remove the terrorist threat, because Afghanistan won't become a home to terrorists any longer, but also, of course, because then you will be doing good to the people of Afghanistan. You will leave Afghanistan a better place than when you arrived there. The challenge for that exposes is that division between counterinsurgency and counterterrorism comes back in part at the strategic and political level to what we think we're trying to do with war. Whether we're trying to make the world a better place with an extraordinary array of very ambitious objectives, or whether, on the other hand, we are simply concerned with our own national security, and by we I don't just mean Britain, I mean other states, and we see war as an instrument to be used in the limited ways in which I think it is being used, devoid of grandiose vocabulary and devoid of some of the greater objectives which the United States in particular is fond of injecting into its thinking about war. If we are to resolve those problems and resolve those tensions, we probably need, obviously, to think about the relationship between war and policy and where we're going with them. But if we're also dealing with the issue of what we're doing with war, we also need to understand it at the operational level. So let me conclude by making two quick sets of observations about both those two aspects and how it affects the character of war today. First of all, to pick up a point which I have already made about the relationship between war and policy, and the notion that war for us in Europe today has no utility, despite the arguments presented by humanitarian intervention, or despite, on the other hand, the arguments presented by national security, that war is counterintuitive as an act. That if we begin with that presumption, then what war is a profound discontinuity, a profound change. And what we have to recognize, of course, behind what I think actually is a fundamental truth for Western liberal democracies, which is that war is discontinuous. What we have to recognize is that when war comes, it will come almost certainly by surprise, because it's so against our expectations that what confronts us with a challenge is the contingency, is the immediacy, is the notion that policy turns on a dime. That war in Libya, having not been anticipated in October 2010 when the national security strategy is produced, can then become possible when circumstances in Libya make it in the eyes of the French and British governments in particular, a necessary act. A necessary act legitimated, of course, by the principle of humanitarian intervention. But the second observation would be this, and that is that if we continue to characterize wars in terms which use negatives, that use words like counterinsurgency, irregular warfare, peace enforcement, all words which are the opposite of war in many ways in terms of what they're trying to describe or are determined to eliminate war, then at the operational and tactical level, what we won't understand or what we won't have a grasp of is a vocabulary that provides coherence for us as we confront war at the operational and tactical level. What I mean by this is that in trying to distance ourselves from the experience of total war in the Second World War, in recognizing that after 9/11, far too much of our military thinking was conditioned by the legacy of that, by Cold War legacies, and by the presumption of major war. What we have failed to do is to develop a coherent way of understanding war which rests on a set of viable propositions which are applicable both in general war, if such a war were to occur, and in the context of counterinsurgency or of peace enforcement or any of those other things. And the reason I stress that is that the division between regular and irregular war is, to that extent, a false construct. For a historian, it is self-evident that during the First World War, there were many aspects of that war which we would classify probably as a characteristic regular war, which we would classify as irregular war. The much vaunted Lawrence, fellow of All Souls, of course, much vaunted Lawrence in the desert was fighting an irregular war, an insurgency, even if he was doing it in the name of the state. The Easter Rising, an irregular war fought by an insurgent. And in the Second World War, the importance of partisan operations, for example, on the Eastern Front. Again, the use of irregular war, albeit by the state. So the state can use regular war as well as irregular war. Irregular war can be fought by non-state actors, but non-state actors may themselves aspire to fight like a regular, if they had the capability. Would the terrorists on 9/11 have used bombers rather than hijacked aircraft? The answer, I suspect, is yes. And if they had nuclear missiles, they probably would have used those as well. That these distinctions, when you look at war at the operational and tactical level, become unhelpful. And what that leads us to is, I think, something conceptually really quite important, which is the challenge confronted by Douglas Haig, among others, as Director of Staff Duties in 1909, when he produced the first ever statement of British military doctrine, the Field Service Regulations, and which he said, as Director of Staff Duties, I want to be predicated on the possibility of major war in Europe. And Willie Robertson, then running the Staff College, but to become Chief of the Imperial General Staff in the Second World War, said, but we happen to be more likely to fight a war in, wait for it, Afghanistan. And if we're going to fight a war in Afghanistan, we will need different capabilities and different attitudes from those which we have fighting a major war in Europe. The answer that they came out with in the Field Service Regulations in 1909 was that there were certain general principles, certain general characteristics about the way in which war should be waged, which should shape our thinking about war, and which will be applicable at the tactical and operational level in ways which provided an essential coherence and unity. I'm reminded, by way of conclusion, to refer you to two people, two senior soldiers, no, one's a Marine, beg his pardon, one senior Marine and one soldier, one served in the United States today as CENTCOM Commander, Jim Mattis, and one a soldier serving as our Chief of Defence Staff, both of whom in 2009, they may be old, but they're not old. Jim Mattis particularly looks very old. 100 years after, who both said let us, at the tactical and operational level, get rid of some of the vocabulary that is getting in the way of our understanding what is really going on. Jim Mattis, in getting rid of effects-based operations, one of those other phrases that are crept into the study of war, said in an article, in a directive he sent out as Joint Forces Commander, but also an article which was then published in Joint Forces Quarterly, said, "We must return to time-honored principles and terminology that our forces have tested in the crucible of battle and that are well grounded on the theory and nature of war." What effectively he said is, when it comes to the business of fighting, there is something common here throughout. And that was exactly the same point as David Richards made when he became Chief of the General Staff in 2009, and he gave an address to the Institute for Strategic Studies Global Strategy Forum, and he said, actually, when you come to the business of fighting, at the tactical level, things remain remarkably constant. If I can end, and I've spoken for far too long, for which I apologize, if I can end, 2 years ago, I was attending a lecture at the Australian National War Memorial given by Annette Becker, a distinguished French historian of the First World War, where she quoted an account of a tactical action by an infantry platoon, and she said, which First World War writer was that, to the assembled audience? And they spent their time guessing, because of course it could perfectly well have been an account of First World War action, but it was actually an account by Dexter Filkins, the journalist, of operations in Fallujah in the Iraq War just concluded. So the character of war may change, but there is an underlying continuity, and much of that can be found through the study of war, I would argue, at the operational and tactical level, and that ironically, it is probably at the political level that we face the greatest uncertainty. Thank you very much.